Hey man, it worked. That's really pretty cool. The Sergeant at Arms of the Senate gets to do that, and now I did. My name's Tony Fisher. I'm MPP class of 1982. It's wonderful to see so many members of the tribe here today. I think we all want to be part of a tribe, multiple tribes, and I'm thrilled and honored that somehow I got to be part of this one with all of you. And welcome to the people who are streaming in from New Zealand and Australia and Europe, and those who will be watching this in the days and weeks to come. February 24th, my wife came into our bedroom, with her phone and said Russia's invaded Ukraine. And it wasn't a surprise. It was sad, but it was not a surprise, because our intelligence agencies had been broadcasting at high volume to the world that this was going to happen. One of the first times probably that has ever happened. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to introduce the moderator for our Ukraine-Russia discussion today, Natalie Colbert, who is an MPP 2008. She's the Belfer Center's executive director, and before coming to the center, she served in the Central Intelligence Agency for 13 years. Most recently, she was director of analytic resources and corporate programs for the Near East Mission Center, where she led strategic management of analytic personnel resources. I suppose that's opposite of operational resources, and created a career development seminar for mid-level analysts. Across her CIA career, she's earned awards for leadership excellence, and in 2021 received the Near East Mission Center Award for Excellence in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So Natalie, I will turn it over to you.
All right.
Thank you.
So I know the topic of Russia's war in Ukraine has already come up several times today throughout some of the other panels. Oh, can you hear me? Good? All right. So we have today a quite wide-ranging panel of expertise covering security issues, economic issues, and also behavioral science. So hopefully we'll be able to tackle a couple of different angles to the current situation, current conflict. So I'll do a brief brief introduction of our esteemed panelists, and then I'll kick off with a few questions before we open it up to Q&A from the audience. So our first panelist, Matt Bunn, is the James Schlesinger Professor of the Practice of Energy, National Security, and Foreign Policy. He is also the co-principal investigator of the Managing the Atom project here at the Belfer Center, which is a research program that's focused on nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, as well as non-proliferation and disarmament. Before coming to Harvard, Matt served as an advisor to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as a study director at the National Academy of Sciences and as editor of Arms Control Today. Our second panelist is Julia Minson. She's the Associate Professor of Public Policy and is a decision scientist who also teaches courses here on negotiations and decision making. One of her primary areas of research addresses the psychology of disagreement, and she runs a lab at HKS called the Minson Conflict and Collaboration Lab, which is an interdisciplinary group of researchers looking at decision-making, negotiations, conflicts, and the psychology of language. Also of note for today's discussion, she has a personal connection to this region, having both mixed Russian and Ukrainian roots, and she immigrated to the US when she was 12. Our final panelist is Jeffrey Frankel. He is the James Harpel Professor of Capital Formation and Growth. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And he has previously served at the Council of Economic Advisors in two different periods, from 1983 to 84, as well as again in 1996 to 99. And as a CEA member in the Clinton administration, he specifically focused on international economics, macroeconomics, and the environment. So please welcome our panelists. So as you can tell, it's quite a wide-ranging expertise area. So what I thought I'd do with the first question is really to just sort of orient us towards a few of the dynamics we've been looking at when it comes to Russia's invasion in Ukraine. So I'll ask each of you to answer, in the context of your specific research or areas of expertise, what are some of the key developments or trends that have surprised you or that have evolved as this conflict has unfolded since February? So Matt, I'll start with you.
Well, I think, like almost everyone, I've been surprised at Ukraine's remarkable resistance to the Russians and the Russians' repeated military failures. I've also been surprised at the level of pointless atrocity that the Russian forces have been committing. It's not just shelling civilian areas where there are actual military forces to be hit, but it's just randomly shelling, maternity hospitals, theaters where people are sheltering and so on. I've also been surprised in my own field at how frequently Putin has felt the need to rattle the nuclear saber. This is really, I think, it's the first huge armored invasion in the middle of Central Europe since World War II, but it's also the first time we've really seen a nuclear armed power specifically using nuclear weapons as a shield behind which to launch such an invasion, a shield behind which to use the conventional sword. And nuclear weapons have been shaping this conflict really from the beginning. They're the reason why, in significant part, you could have these long columns of armor not getting blasted by NATO aircraft, because the United States and NATO have been concerned that if they intervened militarily directly, the fog of war, the uncertainties of managing huge military enterprises could lead to unwanted escalation that no one really planned for, that could lead to nuclear war. President Biden said, if we send our troops in ourselves, that will be World War III. Now, of course, it's not inevitable that the moment Americans and Russians start shooting at each other, you end up going all the way to nuclear war. But the risk is there, and that has deterred us. Similarly, it has deterred Putin from attacking NATO directly. But I think there is still a risk, especially as Russia does worse and worse. I think Putin can't afford to lose, and we end up, I think, with an increased risk that he might decide to use a few nuclear weapons to force Ukraine to surrender or to accept Putin's terms. The Biden administration has had a team looking into how do we deter them from doing that? How do we respond if they do? They've been extremely skilled at keeping their ideas secret, so I have no idea what options they're proposing. I do think that this whole episode is forcing us to rethink almost every aspect of the nuclear policies that we think about it in managing the atom. In nuclear deterrence, we have to think about a more aggrieved, risk-acceptant Russia, a Russia that will, with its conventional forces greatly weakened after this war, will probably be more reliant on nuclear weapons than they were before. In arms control or nuclear risk reduction, we're going to have much more need to reduce nuclear risks, because the level of intense hostility between Russia and the rest of the world will probably last for years, creating more risk and yet making it much more difficult to take any risk reduction actions. At the moment, all arms control talks have been cut off, and the last remaining agreement limiting US and Russian forces expires in February of 2026. It forces us to rethink nuclear nonproliferation, because here we have a state that gave up the nuclear weapons on its soil being dismembered by a nuclear armed state. That may lead additional states to think about wanting nuclear weapons. It forces us to rethink nuclear safety and security, because we've been thinking about accidents or non-state saboteurs, and now we have to think about the actual military forces of a state taking over a nuclear power plant or shelling a nuclear facility. And it forces us to think again about some aspects of nuclear energy, because on the one hand, we have even more incentive than before to get off of oil and gas as fast as we can. But on the other hand, we have to think about the possibility that there might be wars where those nuclear plants were over the decades and decades that they'd be operating. So I'll leave it there.
All right, so I'm going to come back to several of those key topics, but I'll move next to Julia.
All right, well, I am going to start by talking a little bit about the work that we've been doing with respect to the conflict. I am a social psychologist and I study conflict communication. So most of my research deals with how do we get people to have meaningful, thoughtful conversations with each other when their values, their beliefs, and even their very understanding of what's true and what's false are in sort of diametric opposition. And so most of the work that I've done in the space has been dealing with American partisan conflict. And as Natalie mentioned, I was born in the former Soviet Union. Half my family is Russian, half my family is from Ukraine. So when the war started, I was really looking for a way to contribute with my research, contribute with my money, like many people have. I realized that I can make more impact with my research than with my money. And I came across a project that was founded by a group of Norwegian tech activists that they called mail2ru.org. So it's the word mail, the number 2ru.org. And basically what they've done is they scraped millions of email addresses of people located in Russia and organized an international network of volunteers sending messages to Russia urging peace and, most importantly, urging people to download VPNs and get access to independent Western media, right? And the kind of brilliant technical idea, which is not very technical, was that people from all over the world sending messages in small batches were much less likely to get caught by spam filters than having one place sending hundreds of thousands of messages. And so the whole project is entirely volunteer driven. At this point, we've sent well over 100 million email messages to Russia. And the reason I got involved was because I went on the website and I tried to send a message, and then I read the message. And then I thought, we know a lot in behavioral science about how to make this better, about how to make this more effective, about how to make this message actually drive engagement and drive thoughtful, potentially dialogue, instead of actually escalating hostility and escalating frustration. And so I found the people in Norway and said, can I help you rewrite your message? And they said, well, that would be wonderful, but could you also create a steady stream of messages just like this one? And so now there is yet another network of volunteers of people who are mostly social scientists who are trained in writing, obviously because it's part of their job, but who have also been trained in sort of the principles that we have studied in my lab, who are writing messages, and then other volunteers translating these messages into Russian. And so this project is sort of moving along, and we're hoping that it's making an impact. The thing that has surprised me, I would say, is twofold. One, the incredible level of propaganda and the success that the propaganda has had in Russia right now. Having spent my childhood in the former Soviet Union, I remember extreme propaganda. I remember having 2 TV channels that all they broadcast was, this factory achieved its 5-year plan, and this other factory achieved its 5-year plan, and everybody was always achieving the 5-year plan, and that was the only thing on the news. But even at that time, people whispered. Right? People in private expressed their dissent, and people snuck books into the country that were, printed and hand retyped, and it was understood that the public pronouncements that were pro-communist were very different than what a lot of people felt in private. And so now, from sort of a behavioral science perspective, right, there's this huge question of just how much support there is for the war in Russia. And the numbers vary depending on surveys. But even the lowest numbers seem sort of surprisingly high to me. The second thing that has surprised me is a little bit more positive, which is the tremendous number of people around the world who are willing to spend time and money and effort towards fighting the propaganda. So at one point we had over 500,000 volunteers sending these messages, and Mail to RU is only one such effort, right? There's people sending things through WhatsApp, there is people making phone calls to Russia, there are people sending images, there are people sending up Telegram channels, and that's just the anti-propaganda effort that is almost entirely people who are just so outraged they feel like they want to contribute by breaking through sort of the disinformation wall. And that willingness and that investment of effort, I think, I was shocked by and continue to be shocked by, and it gives me a lot of hope.
All right, great, thank you. Over to you, Jeff.
So the question is what surprised us, and my assignment is economic sanctions. I think that economic sanctions have been surprisingly strong and surprisingly effective. In December, Joe Biden said that he gave a speech, spoke publicly, and said that he had told Putin directly that if he invaded Russia, that the consequences would be devastating for the economy. I don't think anybody really took that completely at face value. It didn't have a lot of credibility. Obviously, Putin wasn't scared off by it. It's not hard to see the reasons. When Russia took Crimea, we put on sanctions, but they didn't really accomplish very much. And since then, Putin had only strengthened his economic position. He had built up foreign exchange reserves. The Bank of Russia had built up foreign exchange reserves to pretty high levels. And he had diversified them out of dollars. Most foreign exchange reserves held by central banks are in dollars, the biggest share. And they deliberately diversified out of dollars. So in speculating ahead of time as to what sanctions there might be, kind of the most we were hoping for to achieve was cutting off major Russian banks from SWIFT, the communications network that is involved in international transfers, and maybe a bit more, but we got a lot more than that. First off, the Germans very quickly announced discontinuation of the Nord Stream 2 project, which was not expected that they would do that so easily. Second, various Western central banks and institutions froze Russia's foreign exchange reserves, not just the dollars, but the gold and the other currencies that were held abroad, which isn't all of it, but it is I think more than half of it. And that was a surprise that we could do that, even if it wasn't in dollars. And SWIFT did cut off the major banks. Russian banks. So disrupting Russian finance has been an effective part of the sanctions. There's refusing to buy or boycotting Russian fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, even coal and uranium. They've got a lot of energy products. The U.S. has done that completely. Britain has said they'll phase out the purchases of Urals crude by the end of the year. The big question is what the European Union will do. Of course, China and India are not on board. The big question is how much the EU thinks it can do, because it has made itself, unfortunately, so dependent on natural gas piped in from Russia. Other sanctions, well, a bit surprisingly is that cutting off U.S. and other exports to Russia has perhaps had greater effect than cutting off the imports. So the economy and industry and military is dependent on components and high-tech products that they can only buy from outside the country. And that, I think, has been pretty effective at just gradually shutting down their industry, manufacturing, and their military. We or foreign countries produce components in the tanks and the guidance systems for the aircraft, and that's a pretty direct effect. There's other sanctions too, of course, on individuals and all that. The effect, I said they're surprisingly strong and surprisingly effective. It's too early to say. Well, we know immediately the Russian stock market fell by almost a half. Inflation went up to 20%, which was more than double. The central bank had to raise the interest rate to 20%, which was more than doubling relative to the beginning of the year. And then here on out, we're going to watch the statistics come in, to the extent we can follow them, on Russian economic activity, GDP. It's very hard to say, but this various estimates that people have made through various models or otherwise seem to cluster around about 15% fall in GDP this year in 2022, whereas Russia had been growing at 2% a year before the pandemic. So that's pretty big, and that's not even assuming that the EU is able to cut off its imports of natural gas completely, but just partially. So you often hear that Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world, but if that 15% is right, so 11th largest is about equal with Brazil. If the 15% is right, then as we watch, they're falling down the rankings, and by the end of the year would be roughly at 15th, which is Iran.
Okay. So we have a lot of topics out on the table. I'm going to follow up on each of those just briefly. So I'm going to come back to you, Matt, on some of the comments you made about specifically how this might change conversations around deterrence and our thinking towards nuclear policy in broader context. So you mentioned the existing talks are off. You mentioned the existing agreements are going to expire in 2026. So, and this idea of putting us in a place of rethinking what deterrence looks like in other aspects of armed control. So can you help expand on where you see that potentially going? What are some of the ideas that might be circulating in terms of how this might be changing, or what ideas might move us forward in a different way?
Well, I think we were already, before the war, having to do some serious rethinking. We have a more multipolar nuclear world than we had before. I mean, we're talking about the war in Ukraine, but meanwhile, China is building hundreds of new nuclear missile silos. North Korea, we have no progress in talks, no talks with them, and they may very well carry out a nuclear test during Biden's trip to Asia. And Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon than it's ever been, and we're stuck at the moment in the effort to get back to the Iran nuclear deal. So in any case, we have a more multipolar nuclear world. We have growing hostility between the major nuclear powers, the United States and Russia, the United States and China. And we have new technologies or evolving technologies that are affecting strategic balances, even if they're not nuclear themselves. Cyber, precision conventional weapons, counter space weapons, missile defenses, and more. So my research group just a week ago launched a global research network involving universities and think tanks and scholars in more than a dozen countries on the topic of rethinking nuclear deterrence. I think we need to think hard about what are the most dangerous pathways by which a nuclear war might begin. What can we do to reduce the dangers on those pathways? I think we need to think hard about, are there realistic alternatives to continuing to rely on nuclear threats forever? One of the working groups we have in this network is focused on how will evolving technologies affect the picture. One of them is focused on what are the legal, ethical, and moral aspects of relying on nuclear deterrence. So I think there's a lot of this that needs to be rethought. But there are some fundamentals that remain. I mean, the power of nuclear weapons hasn't changed. There is, I should say, I'm being kind of dark here, but there is, one should remember, some quite good news about nuclear weapons. I mean, more than 4/5 of all the nuclear weapons that used to exist in the world have been dismantled. More than half of all the countries that used to have potential nuclear weapons material on their soil have gotten rid of it. And much of that work was done by a program suggested here at the Kennedy School. We have shown over the years that we are able, through good policy, to reduce these dangers. And, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a similar moment of peril, both sides decided it's time to step back from the brink, and fairly quickly negotiated the Limited Test Ban Treaty, put in place a hotline, and began the process that ultimately led to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to limits on strategic arms. So, they say never let a crisis go to waste. It's my hope that we will use the time when there aren't any talks to develop ideas that will then be available to governments when talks begin. I'm a participant, as are many others, in Track 2 dialogues that is non-government dialogues that are still ongoing with the Russians. And in those discussions, we've laid out quite a number of risk reduction ideas for the next round of arms control to try to address some of these challenges.
All right, thank you. So Julia, to follow up on the project that you mentioned and the email campaign, I had two follow-up questions. So as I understand, right, one of the goals of the campaign is to hopefully get some of these recipients to respond and to engage in a dialogue. So my first question was, have you seen that actually happening? Are we getting responses back from the people who are receiving the emails? And what, if anything, are you able to gauge about variation across communities in Russia who have maybe these pro-Russian views? Are there differences in variation in that? So that's the first part of that question. And then the second one is how are you measuring, like what's the plan to measure the impact? So we have this email campaign out, and part of the goal is to persuade them to at least either open the aperture or consider other sources of information. So how do we know if this campaign is contributing to that?
Yeah, so it's a very tricky question, and of course the reason it's tricky is because in Russia right now, there is a 15-year prison term for spreading disinformation, right? And one of the things that they classify as disinformation is calling the war in Ukraine a war, right? Almost all Russian email addresses are part of Russian internet service providers that we can have a fair amount of confidence share their data with the government. Right, so when we are sending emails to people, I'm not sure that we really want them writing back. We want them to feel welcome to write back if they feel safe to do so, but it is a risk that we don't necessarily want to be encouraging too much. So really what we are hoping is the action that people take is download a VPN and get out to Western media in a way that's untraceable by the government. And because it's untraceable by the government, it's also untraceable by us, right? We don't want to create a giant repository somewhere that's full of names and email addresses of every Russian that has responded to us, because what if that thing gets hacked? So our approach at this point has been really sort of not be concerned about impact evaluation, but be concerned first and foremost about the safety of both the volunteers in the West and the recipients in Russia. That being said, the reason we believe this is likely having some effectiveness is because everything we're doing is based on experimentally tested approaches in psychology and decision science that we have tested in other contexts, right? So there are labs all over the world that are testing different communication approaches in sort of very rigorous ways, where you can then ask questions of research participants and measure their responses and measure their behavior. And so we're saying, the way we're thinking about it is that we conducted the research under controlled laboratory conditions. We know how effective it was in that context, Now we're going to put it into a different context. Certainly things will change, right? Certainly it's not going to have the same effects as it does in, the American partisanship setting, but the hope is that using science in a different context still gets you similar results. The other thing that gives me hope is that there is a lot of tracking going on of online activity in Russia, and in particular downloads of VPNs, right? So as I mentioned, we're not the only project doing this. There are lots of organizations that are doing various versions of this type of effort, and the number of VPNs downloaded in Russia since the end of February has just been completely unprecedented. So Russians are certainly getting out to the free, unfettered internet. Now, some of them are doing it because they want their yoga videos and they want to watch, cats frolicking like we all do on YouTube. But some of them are doing it because they want accurate news reporting. And so we see evidence of that, although of course we don't know which project to attribute it to directly.
Okay. Jeff, I want to follow up on your opening comments around sanctions. Obviously this week the G7 met, and some of the concerns that came out of that, obviously highlighting fears of a potential global economic slowdown and referencing these various compounding effects between supply chains, lockdowns in China, the energy crisis, rising prices, et cetera. So the question is, in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine and the ongoing sanctions, what do these compounding factors elsewhere in the economy, what might they mean for the unity of US and European sanctions moving forward?
Well, sanctions generally don't work because they're generally not multilateral, and the targeted country can just switch and buy or sell its products from other countries. The ones that do work are pretty comprehensively multilateral. That's an historical statement. And that's a statement, I think, about the current situation. A big chunk of that is getting the European Union to cut back its imports of fossil fuels, as I said, from Russia. That's asking a lot for them to do. Could have a very negative impact on their economies. Our colleague Ricardo Hausmann had an idea that I think was a very good idea, and it's gotten some attention, but I haven't heard any official movement on it, which is, instead of cutting off a quantity of Russian oil exports, or for that matter, instead of them cutting off a quantity of their exports, that we put a tariff, a high tariff, we meaning as many countries as can sign up for it, US, Europe, the East Asian countries that see things similarly to us, put up a high uniform tariff. And that has the same effect of cutting the oil exports, but we can take the revenue and use it for all kinds of things, whether it's compensating low-income citizens for the increase in gas prices, or whether it's using it the money to rebuild Ukraine. We can make sure not just that Russia is hurt, but that our goals are not hurt at the same time. I think there's some very some of these things that I mentioned we're doing. The release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, I think, is a sensible idea. When we divide into this together with our allies, so the total, I think, 250 million barrels, that's enough to have some impact as a bridge towards when Europeans and others can make more of the transition to renewables, to natural gas, and to nuclear. I'd be curious what Matt thinks of this. I think Germany is nuts to close down its remaining nuclear power plants, which it's planning. It's been doing this for 10 years, and then they closed down 3 in December, and it's closing down the last 3 later this year. And I just think that's crazy, whether you're talking about the effects on the geopolitical goals or the environmental goals, global warming, or just the economic welfare. I think that one is wrong. I'll conclude with one other thing that I think is wrong, even though it's very politically popular, is a gas tax holiday, which some US states have done, and some foreign countries have put on suspended other taxes on retail refined petroleum products. I understand the economic attraction of that, but it's terrible economics. It hurts the environmental goal because it encourages people to drive more, and it hurts the geopolitical goal because it encourages the demand for oil when we want to be decreasing the demand for oil.
So I want to just, in the last kind of round of follow-up, I want to pick up on that topic, Jeff, that you mentioned, this tension potentially between some of our cleaner energy goals and energy security issues. So I know earlier today there was a panel on climate change and geopolitics, and this came up in the context of Russia-Ukraine. So the follow-up question really is drilling down on this idea. So as we formulate, say, energy policy, like how might some of these geopolitical goals potentially conflict with environmental goals, and how do you thread the needle on driving still forward on energy security and renewables while prepping for the fact that you have these potential supply disruptions and other things that will come in sideways?
So, I mean, some people are saying that because of the need to punish Russia, we have to suspend or give up on the environmental goals. This is a drill, baby, drill idea. And that's why there's a general impression, perhaps, that the geopolitical goals are at odds with the green goals. But that need not be the case at all. I'm going to I'll quickly go through 6 things we can do or are doing that are consistent with making Russia feel some pain and consistent with the environment. I already mentioned some of them. First is the obvious one, sanctions, putting up a tariff against imports of oil from Russia. Second one is, I also mentioned, is the release of the reserves in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and our allies doing the same. Now, there's some people who say we don't need the Strategic Petroleum Reserve anymore because it's inconsistent with the energy transition to renewables, or because we're no longer a net energy importer. But that's an argument it's also an argument for releasing some of the oil in the reserves. It's just an argument for not replacing the oil later on, which is a separate question. Continuing the momentum for renewables, reducing the cost of renewables in every way we can, and I don't think we're currently doing that. I have in mind particularly barriers against imports of solar panels and wind turbines. It's surprising how often this sector, which we want to encourage, is penalized by import tariffs. Switch to nuclear, I mentioned natural gas. If Europe is going to do without natural gas, then that means importing more liquefied natural gas to the extent possible. And that might sound anti-environmental, but the natural gas emits half the carbon of coal. And it means shipping it, LNG, liquefied natural gas, which has a certain expense. To the extent that we're going to be producing more natural gas, I think a really important part of it is that we need better regulation of fracking to cut drastically down on the methane that's released into the atmosphere. And as I understand it, that's not actually that hard to do. Just need the willpower to do it.
Matt, anything that you would add on the nuclear energy piece of it?
Well, I will say that the extraordinary prices that oil and natural gas have gone to are making both renewables and nuclear more economically attractive and profitable than they were before. Two key differences between renewables and nuclear. One, the renewables are intermittent. And so you don't have the electricity if the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And storage can really help us a lot on shifting the time of day. Say it's sunny during the afternoon and you need the electricity in the evening. But in terms of shifting the season, we don't really have gigawatt year scale storage except for pumped hydro in a few places. And so having some kind of low carbon, non-intermittent source, I think is going to be important for future grids. However, the other difference is you can build wind turbines and solar plants in a big fat hurry. It takes a long time to build nuclear plants as they currently exist. There are some people working on new technologies that they claim will solve that problem. But I hate to be pessimistic, but I would note that nobody has successfully commercialized a genuinely new nuclear energy design in over half a century. And there are some reasons to be optimistic, but there are also reasons to be pessimistic about the wave of innovation attempts that are happening in the nuclear industry. So I think keeping some nuclear plants open is something that could be done to reduce natural gas requirements, but building a lot of new nuclear plants fast is not something we really have the capability to do. That's a longer term approach.
Okay, before we open it up to Q&A to the audience, Julia, last question to you. You mentioned a lot of your additional work also focuses on the domestic context too. Are there any lessons that you're drawing from this current project or the focus on engaging Russian recipients that helps us think more about how we might apply this type of work in the domestic context?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are huge parallels. Disinformation and willingness to embrace disinformation is intimately related to partisan polarization, right? When people on opposite sides of a topic dislike each other and distrust each other, they're much more willing to believe things that are not true as long as it says something bad about the other side. And we are, of course, in a situation in the United States where people who ascribe to liberal ideologies versus conservative ideologies have a very, very hard time tolerating each other's ideas. And so as a result, we are much more vulnerable to malicious actors exploiting that state of affairs. One of the things that I've learned from this project, something I mentioned earlier on, is there are just thousands of people out there who are willing to cross the bridge and engage with somebody and talk to them and try to inform them. Now, on one hand, what that tells me is that there's a huge untapped workforce. Right? Let's organize Americans who want to engage with somebody on the other side and give them an easy system to do it. But on the other hand, a lot of what I noticed is people who are motivated enough to engage are also really angry, right? What they want to say is, you are wrong. And that's not very helpful. So what we need is a system that enables people to communicate easily, right? And then we need to give them the training in order to communicate effectively, right? And that, I think, is by far easier in the US because at least we're dealing with English instead of having to translate everything into Russian. And we're not trying to hide our activities from the government. So I think there's a lot of potential of taking some of these lessons and applying them to the American polarization context, and I think it could be very, very fruitful.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we are, with the remaining time, we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. So just a few reminders for everyone who's been a student at the school. You know the rules of the forum. Please just state your name and what class year you're from. And to maximize the number of questions we can get in, please keep your questions brief. Make sure they end in a question mark. I will also note, I believe we have a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, in our audience. So welcome any comments that you might want to share as well. So. Thank you. All right, so we'll start over here.
Hi, Sri Kulkarni, mid-career 2017, also former State Department, 14 years, and one of the founding members of the Ukraine Comms Task Force. My question is about the end game. As of today, we're sending $40 billion of mainly weapons to Ukraine. But simply put, would it not be cheaper and more effective, especially in terms of weakening morale and weakening the Putin administration, to simply buy out the Russian army? And full transparency, I am pitching this actively to members of Congress, friends of the administration right now. If anybody wants to work on it, please let me know. But simply put, $100,000 and a green card for you and your family to every member of the Russian military who defects to America.
Any takers?
So that's a fascinating idea. making use of human incentives. I do think there needs to be a lot more thought about how does this end. I think it's going to end ugly in one way or another. I think the notion that we'll just have a Ukrainian victory and Russia will, go home and lick its wounds is not very likely. I think Putin can't afford to have something that he can't pitch as a victory at home. Fortunately, as Julia said, he has almost total control of the information environment so that he could pitch almost anything as a victory. But I think the more the Ukrainians have real victories against the Russians, the more the risk that Putin may escalate further increases. And so that creates some real dilemmas for us. I think that one way or another, we're probably the most plausible scenario that I can see is some sort of armistice type situation where nobody agrees as to who legally controls which parts, but the fighting stops for the time being, and we end up with a more or less frozen conflict as there was since 2014, but with Russia controlling a bit more than it has prior to the invasion. That would be very ugly, but it's hard for me to see a better scenario than that doesn't carry enormous risks in the course of getting there. But I think it's a quite interesting idea that you're proposing.
Maybe I'll take a stab at that idea. It would be a great idea if it's practical. I wonder how a Russian soldier who wants to defect but is surrounded by other Russian soldiers with big guns, how he would or she would actually go about doing that. Keep in mind, many of them don't want to be there in the first place. They already have an incentive. They don't want to get killed, and yet they're doing what they're doing because it's really hard to get out of fighting for your side when you're in a part of an army.
Okay, we'll go over here.
Hi, yeah. So my name is Liam. I'm actually the son of one of the alumni from the class of 2007. So I want to ask a question about international relations theory, how it applies to the conflict. So one of the ways we evaluate an international relations theory is by its explanatory power and how it can explain events. And one of the main ideas of current theories of interdependence is that if a country is dependent on another country, and then the country is also dependent on that country, then conflict is not probable and it's impossible. But now we're in a situation where one advanced country has attacked another advanced country and they're in a war. So my question is, how does this conflict sort of impact that international relations theory paradigm of interdependence and the improbability of war?
So it's a great question, but I would argue that most IR theorists would say that deep interdependence reduces, but by no means eliminates, the risk of war. When World War I began, the states of Europe were becoming much more interdependent than they had been before, and there were a bunch of articles published in the years before the war saying war is impossible because we're also interdependent now and so on.
Norman Angell in particular.
I think that I believed war was not going to happen until fairly late because any good Kennedy School of Policy analysis would say that the risk of invading was bigger than the risk of not invading. But Putin clearly looked at it a different way. And I think one of the things we need to do as we build our policies of deterrence and trying to influence other countries is think hard about how they see the risks of inaction. I think Putin, at least in the long term, thought that if he doesn't act, Ukraine is inevitably drifting, if not de jure, at least de facto, into the NATO camp, that someday there would be NATO or US offensive missiles in Ukraine with a very short flight time to Moscow. He described that as a dagger at our throat. And when he thinks of himself, he thinks of himself like Peter the Great. And when he's thinking legacy, he's thinking, geez, that would be my fault if I let that happen. And I think also, as Jeff was saying, that he grossly underestimated the military difficulty and the economic impact of sanctions. So he saw the cost and risk as lower than I saw it when I was looking at it, and he saw the risk of inaction as much higher than I saw it, and so he then made the decision to invade. But it is clear now that the interdependence you speak of was huge, and that Putin, I think, hadn't really thought through just how dependent Russia is in a variety of ways on the rest of the world, and how much sanctions might end up affecting not only his economy, but his military.
Any other comments?
I would add to that a little bit. First of all, I completely agree that we want to be very careful about treating one event as nullifying a theory that talks about probabilities. The other piece of it, I think, is very important to consider is, again, the information, right? In assuming sort of a rational analysis based on complete information, we are talking about a setting where the Russian population doesn't have complete information, and also Putin is not receiving complete information, right? So there have been multiple reports from defectors who say, look, you don't walk into President Putin's office and tell him that his military is not what he expects it to be, right? That is just not a wise move. So the risk-benefit analysis is being potentially done with incomplete information and sort of a very strong bias towards wanting to hear specific things and wanting to draw specific conclusions. And so in that case, you don't reach the same conclusions you would reach if you are, sort of sitting back and thinking about this as an objective analyst.
And to be fair, we've had that experience in the United States as well, the invasion of Iraq being one obvious example.
Let's go back to questions.
Okay, let's go back over here.
Dalamagna, MP, middle 2002. I have a question for each of you. One, what is a VPN? Two, I'm involved in the solar industry. The solar industry is on hold. You can't get parts because of this tariff fight that's going on. Is there anything that can be done about that? And finally, where's every action has a reaction. Is there anyone working on the anti-nuclear bomb?
A VPN is a virtual private network, and then I will hand it off.
Well, explain what a VPN does. Basically, a VPN allows you to hide where you are, where you're coming from. So I have a video online that's about how nuclear weapons work. And for some reason, there's a large fraction of the viewers are from Switzerland or the Netherlands. It's not because people from Switzerland or the Netherlands actually are interested. It's because that's where the VPNs claim they're coming from. And it's actually people in various other countries using VPNs.
Maybe can I ask Matt a question? We have nuclear warheads, not right up against the Russian border, but pretty close, Poland, whatever, and they have the same. To what extent, thinking about a face-saving off-ramp for Putin, if we had some bilateral agreement that both sides we will move back, not have nuclear missiles anywhere near each other's border, could that, which would be a great thing in its own right, could that be a possible face-saving way that Putin could declare a victory?
One of the pieces of great news is we already did that like 30 years ago. So all of Russia's nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, are in centralized storage fairly far from they have the missiles that could use them are also fire conventional missiles from the same launchers. And so they're close to the front, but the actual weapons are in storage sites that, as you might imagine, U.S. intelligence is watching very closely. There so far isn't any indication that we're aware of anything being moved out of these central storage sites. The United States does have just under 200 air-delivered gravity bombs for tactical nuclear purposes in Europe, but they're in sort of core NATO countries. They're in Germany and Netherlands, Italy, and so on, or reportedly they're in those places. They're not anywhere near the front lines now, and we have no ballistic missiles that could get to Russia quickly that are located in Europe. We do on submarines and various other places, but the good news is we've already done that. The questioner also had, is anybody working on anti-nuclear weapons? The reality is that the power of nuclear weapons is so immense that it makes defense almost impossible. We do have, in the United States, a quite limited missile defense capability, mainly not to defend against Russia because its nuclear forces would easily overwhelm the defenses that we have, but to defend against small attacks from, say, North Korea or something like that. So far, no one has come up with an idea for how we could really provide a reliable defense against nuclear weapons. And so what we have done to reduce risk is a variety of steps to improve communication, avoid incidents that could escalate, and limit the nuclear forces in ways that make things more predictable, offer more transparency and monitoring, offer a channel of dialogue where each side can express its key strategic concerns and have them addressed. And that, I think, reduces perceptions of threat, which themselves are an important driver of risk, I think. So we've figured out ways to reduce risk, not ways to solve the problem.
Okay, I'm going to go over here next.
Yeah, Michaela Späth. I'm the German ambassador to the OECD. Previously, I was the climate and energy ambassador in the foreign ministry. So actually, the International Energy Agency has just come out with a plan, 10 points how to reduce the oil dependency. You might look at that piece, like just take 10 kilometers off your highest speed you're allowed on the highway, and you have a big reduction. And don't forget, the International Energy Agency was founded in the oil crisis, and one of the first issues was to put 3 months' worth of oil consumption in any country in storage, and we have quite a bit of that. But I was not going to talk about all of that because this is very much known. I'm curious, as somebody who has been for 35 years in a foreign ministry, have we thought about 2 things? One is on the sanction side. We are blocking the gold and the dollar reserves and everything of the central bank. What impact has that of the volatility of the dollar in the long run? We are doing this also to show to China what it would mean if you go into Taiwan. Doesn't it mean that a lot of investors in the big countries, will they put their national reserves, continue to put into dollars? Or does this not mean, which we can already see in certain places, that countries are de-investing out of the dollar? This is my one question which I see. And the other question is, we are doing a lot of sanctions, a lot of companies are withdrawing from Russia, but there will be a time, and we have to think about that too, when Putin is gone, and hopefully there is not a lot war, how will we rebuild an connected economic network where all the big investors are out or have sold their stuff to others. Are you already thinking, you are the think tanks, about this? And maybe we as the practical politicians are not yet thinking about this. Thank you.
So on the reserves, as I mentioned, one sort of surprise here, at least it was largely a surprise to me, is that we could shut down Russian access to their reserves that weren't in dollars but were held abroad, gold and other currencies. There has been a concern for a while that the dollar would be challenged as an international currency, and that would, both in an economic sense and in terms of international political power, that might have negative consequences. There's a very slow downward trend in terms of foreign exchange reserves held by the world's central banks, downward trend in the share allocated to dollars. So by that measure, maybe there's some justification for the fear. And the fear is that if we use it to back up sanctions, particularly kind of abuse the privilege, as I think we did. I think when President Trump tore up the Iran nuclear treaty or agreement, that there wasn't a lot of support in Europe for our sanctions, and that kind of made it more likely that and easier for Russia and other countries to switch out of dollars and out of Western banks. But one question that comes up a lot is, are they shifting? Well, it used to be they're shifting into yen. That was in the 80s. And the answer was basically no. Were they shifting into Deutschmarks? That was in the early 90s. The answer was basically no. At least not very much. And now it's renminbi. Are they shifting into renminbi? And the renminbi is slowly rising as an international currency, but it's sort of about even with Australia. And the movement out of dollars tends to be into some smaller currencies. It's very marginal, very slow, into smaller currencies like the Australian dollar and the Singapore dollar. And, you know, they're on our side.
All right, so go over here. Oh.
What about, there was a second question that I didn't.
Oh, sorry.
Second question, what does it mean that the entire industry is now de-investing from Russia?
Right.
And are you thinking about this? I mean, this has
So
real consequences.
I do think people need to think about, there are really two purposes for sanctions that are getting sort of mixed up. One is just punishment, and one is trying to change behavior. If you want to try to change behavior, you have to sort of lay out, if you did this plausible set of steps, the following sanctions would be lifted. And you have to make that credible. And the United States is not very good at lifting sanctions and keeping them lifted. It's with the politics of the United States, it's very difficult. So right now, I think Putin thinks that these sanctions will last forever to first approximation, and I think many people in Washington are feeling the same. That doesn't give him much incentive to change course. I think the broader question of how do we rebuild when the sanctions are over is something that does need to be thought about, and hasn't been thought about very much yet, because we're still working on how do we build them up.
I think there's also a related piece of this, which is sort of the individual psychology piece, which is rank and file Russians, right, are getting a tremendous amount of blame for what's happening in the conflict, and it's unclear when is it appropriate and when it's not. But maintaining relationships and maintaining the sense that the West is not sort of out to get us, right, is a very important piece for restarting economic and cultural relationships when this is hopefully one day over, right? So a lot of the stories right now about boycotting Russian artists or boycotting Russian performers or Russian students. Some of our students have reported stories of sort of being mistreated in the US because of what Russia is doing. None of that is helpful to the future restarting of sort of both economic and social relationships.
Okay, so we have just under 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go here, but let's try to keep our questions brief as possible.
Sure. I'm Marge Stockford. I'm mid-career, class of 1992. And this is a question for Professor Minson. In the last session, the last panel that I just went to about international security and democracy, one of the panelists, Sergei, and I'm sorry I didn't get the last name, mentioned that the Russian public support of the military operation in Ukraine is at about 84%. And that's a pretty disappointing figure, particularly based on what you're talking about in terms of all these efforts that are going to try to fight disinformation. So, and it's also therefore not very hopeful for those of us who are hoping that the Russian public, rank and file, will fight against Putin's policy. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on what you think the reasoning behind that is.
Yeah, so, I mentioned earlier that it's really unclear which polls we can believe. Of course, there are very few independent polling organizations left in Russia, and they also see high numbers of support for the war, partly sort of reflecting on my own childhood, right? When somebody comes to you and says that your responses are private and anonymous, if you're a sane person in Russia, you shouldn't believe them, right? So even the independent polling, it's sort of unclear how accurate they can be. There was a study conducted by some folks at the London School of Economics where they had a very clever approach where they asked for people's support for different ideas, the war and sort of lots of other things. And they had a methodology that allowed them to back out the real support for the war, depending on how the question was asked. They saw something a little over 50%, so a much lower number than 85, but still, greater than half. So the support is high. What it really makes me think about is the just incredible precious value of having a free press. And the fact that part of the way we got here, or part of the way Russia got there, is by the free press being curtailed one bit at a time without anybody noticing that it's happening. And so it's not surprising to some extent that people believe that the war is a special operation when that is literally the only information they're exposed to, right? So I think those numbers are high, but I also hope that with access to more accurate information, they will shift because people tend to respond to information.
Go ahead.
Good evening, think tank. I'm Bill Ahern from the class of, 19, what is it, David? 72. 72, that's right. Well, I'm not. This place has gotten too complicated as far as I can tell. I walked around all the floors today. But anyway there's two parts of this that almost take me back to the 1960s. The American people, you've talked about polling of the Russians and their attitudes. I don't know what the attitude of the American people is towards the Ukraine. I mean, if you read if I read The Economist, and I get the impression that the Ukraine is this tremendously corrupt, oligarch-run bunch of Slavs, but then there's also Ruthenians and Galicians and some other things there, and it's not clear to me why, if we have a horse in the race or not, or why we should. And that's very frustrating to me because I don't think the communication, you say we have a free press, which I think is just confusing everybody, or every night you see on the TV Russian atrocities, bodies, and you see Ukrainian refugees playing the symphony in Poland, or something like that. And that goes on night after night after night, and then that sort of gets you feeling numb about this thing. The attitude of the American people then affects how much nuclear blackmail we're going to put up with by this irrational bully, Putin. I mean, we're not in getting to yes, we're in Tom Schelling, this is what you got to do to win. And with a bully, you get your brother or a friend who's bigger than the bully or has a weapon to punch him out. The United States, Ukraine is getting punched every day, and what Biden said was, we're never going to send an American soldier there, and seems to be totally intimidated and bluffed out by Putin just threatening nuclear war.
I'm going to
So,
have to ask for the question here.
yeah, the question is, what can we, well, I'm in an academic setting now, so I didn't want to get to the question too soon. You know. In fact, I think I've forgotten what it is. Almost. The question is, where the hell are our nuclear aircraft carriers? I looked and saw them scattered all over the world. Why aren't there 3 in the Baltic, 4 in the Mediterranean, and 3 off of Odessa keeping the sea lanes open? There was a question.
So I think I should probably take a first cut at that. I do think it is reasonable for both sides to avoid getting into a situation where they're shooting at each other directly because of the dangers of escalation. I don't actually think Putin has needed all of this nuclear saber rattling that he's done, because I think we were reasonably scared of nuclear escalation already without all the nuclear saber rattling. I do think it is remarkable what Ukraine has managed to accomplish, in part because of what you say about the way Ukraine was. Ukraine was had a deeply dysfunctional political class, which has somehow managed to rally together. And Putin has become, in a certain sense, the patriarch of Ukrainian nationalism. There is much more of a national feeling in Ukraine today, certainly than there was before 2014, or even than there was before February 24 of this year. It is beginning to pull together as a functioning state, and was remarkably lucky that the comedian that they elected turned out to be a remarkably effective wartime leader. I'm not sure I would have predicted that. I'd be interested in Bill Taylor's perspective, actually. Can we get any thoughts from Bill?
Sure.
Thank you. A couple of things about Ukraine. Matt, you're exactly right. Putin has consolidated Ukrainian nationalism in a positive sense in a way that no Ukrainian leader has ever done. They have rallied behind this comedian, this leader, President Zelensky, who did step up. He had never had elective office before, for 2019, stepped up, and it's the Ukrainian people that are supporting him, and he is channeling the Ukrainian people. I mean, it is an amazing unity of the leadership and the people, united as they are. So I think that is an important piece that wherever Bill is, who was just asking this question, but there's a reason that we are supporting Ukraine here, and the broad support it is. So, I mean, we take a look at this 40 billion, but we look at the support in the Congress. It's been It's been Republicans and Democrats. It's been administration after administration. It's been the international community has rallied behind this. And the reason is it's Ukraine fighting for itself, but it's also Ukraine fighting for values that we hold. It's Ukraine demonstrating that, as you say, democracy, flawed as we all are, okay, we all have problems with our democracy, and it's got its own, there's no doubt about it, but it is a real democracy. It's a raucous democracy, as you've indicated, but it is supporting those, it's defending those values. And that's one of the reasons. The other big reason, of course, that we're supporting Ukraine is that for 69 years, a large number of years since World War II, where there was some agreement among nations about how you deal with each other, how you interact with each other, international relations that we've all studied. You respect sovereignty, and the respect for sovereignty of other nations persisted from 1945 until 2014, when the Russians invaded. And plus or minus. I mean, there have been some problems. Okay, you know, but no big wars in Europe during that time. If we want to somehow reestablish that era of relative peace, then the Russians have to get out of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are trying to do that. We're trying to help them. It's going to be a long process, and it won't be pretty. And you've described one of the scenarios as being ugly, but in the end, in my view, they'll prevail. But thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Okay, so we are actually just over time, so that's actually going to conclude our panel for today. Please help join me in thanking our panelists for joining us today. We are getting close to the end of the day, so we can now head over to the JFK Park tent for our evening recession. Info about your class dinners can be found in the Whova app, or you can ask any of the staff members at the registration desk and we'll be able to help you out. Thank you.